The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights now wants the death sentence abolished. The rights body argues that even though the death sentence is still in existence, the penalty is not effective in combating crime, especially when majority of those sentenced are from poor backgrounds. And as Willie Lusige reports, it's now 35 years since the last person facing the death sentence was executed in this country.
The debate around the death penalty has gone on for a number of years. Opinion is divided among Kenyans over the necessity of this penalty. According to human rights activists, Kenya and other East African countries are lagging behind in the abolishment of death sentence.
Zimbabwe, for example, Ghana are very, very close. They're on the cusp of abolition. So I'm very hopeful in the next few years we are going to see more countries moving in that direction.
A report by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights titled Living with a Death Sentence highlights prisoners' experience of crime, punishment and death row.
Its application is discriminatory and targets those from disadvantaged backgrounds who cannot, in most instances, afford good legal representations, have poor knowledge of the legal system, and among others, research shows that this normally targets people who are probably innocent of the crimes they are being charged for.
The report indicates that 81% of all prisoners condemned to death were either from poor backgrounds or unemployed, and in some cases they were condemned for committing petty crimes.
And I think it's fair to say that here in Kenya our research shows that those on death row are not necessarily the worst of the worst. Over half, you'll recall, had been convicted of a non-fatal offence. So the most common reasons given by our participants who had been convicted of murder were that they were in a state of extreme emotion, that they were angry, that they'd been provoked, that they were acting in self-defence. Well, data that we gathered from the Kenya prisoners show that more than 10% of the sample had never been in any formal education. Most all had little or no education. They were of low social and economic status. They were the most disadvantaged, and they were quite vulnerable in terms of their mental health needs or dependencies.
According to KNCHR, the death sentence does not simply work in fighting crime.
Death penalty is not a deterrent. Research has indicated that death penalty is not effective in fighting crime, and therefore its application does not make the society any safer. Violence in form of death penalty only contributes to more violence by the populace.
The rights groups argue that the sentence violates rights to life and is cruel beside being degrading.
Their relationships with their families had worsened, and most participants reported that their families were coping badly. Most of them had not just one or two, but a few dependents. So coping badly might partly reflect that, but it also reflects the emotional trauma of having a family member, a loved one, on death row, with the stigma and the emotional burdens that entails.
The report wants prisons to create a safer space for those sentenced. The last time a Kenyan was executed was 35 years ago.
Actual execution has not taken place in Kenya since 1987, but nonetheless, those convicted for death-eligible offences are still being sentenced to death. So whether Kenya should consider abolition now in law. However, it just hasn't happened, and the question is why.
In 2017, Kenya's Supreme Court declared the mandatory death penalty for murder unconstitutional. This introduced judicial discretion as to whether the death sentence should be imposed. Willie Lusige, KTN News, Nairobi.
The fight against abuse of illicit brews and drugs has been taken a notch higher after it emerged that youth, especially those in Central Region, have abused alcohol. A report published by the National Authority